The raven arrived at dawn, before the camp had stirred. It came not through the usual channels, not through Maester Vyman's tower at River Run, not borne by any bird Robb Stark recognized from the cages his father had kept. It came on a crow so old its feathers had gone ragged at the edges. Its leg band stamped not with the sigil of any castle, but with a single mark, the dire wolf of House Stark, pressed in black wax that had cracked during the journey south. The bird died on the windowsill before anyone could remove the message from its leg. Robb took that as an omen, though he couldn't have said of what. The letter was written in two hands. The first was a maester's, neat, formal, the careful script of a man transcribing another's words under duress. The second was his father's, and it was barely legible. Ned Stark had always written with the deliberate economy of a man who chose words. Like he chose swords, one at a time, with full knowledge of the weight. What Robb held now was nothing like that. The letters slanted and crowded each other. Ink had blotted in places where pressure faltered. A man writing in a black cell, by firelight that flickered at the pleasure of his jailers, with fingers that were already failing him. Robb read it standing. Gray wind lay at his feet and made no sound, which was itself unusual. The dire wolf watched him with amber eyes that held something uncomfortably close to understanding. He read it twice. Then he sat down on the edge of his cot, and for a long while he did not move. If you are reading this, then I am already gone. And that is well. The secret dies with a better keeper than me. I have held it 17 years. I have held it against the counsel of every instinct I possessed. I swore an oath to a dying woman, and I kept it, and I would keep it again. But I am dead, and oaths do not outlast the men who swear them. So I am breaking it now, in the only way I can, by giving it to the one person I trust to know its weight. Lyanna did not die of a fever. She died in a tower in Dorne, 3 days after giving birth to a boy she had named Aegon. The boy's father was Rhaegar Targaryen. The marriage was real. I have seen the documents, hidden where I will not write, in case this letter is opened by other hands. She made me promise. She was dying, and she made me promise that I would protect him, that I would give him a name, a place, a life that didn't end with Robert's warhammer finding him before he could walk. His name is Jon. He has lived as my bastard. He is not. He is the last Targaryen. He is the heir to the Iron Throne. He is your brother, and he is a king. And I am sorry. I am sorry for every lie, and for the silence that has been its own kind of lie, and for the fact that I cannot be there to help you carry this. Do what is right, Robb. You always knew how. That is why I was never afraid for the North. The parchment shook in his hands. He realized after a moment that this was because his hands were shaking, not the parchment. Outside the tent, the camp was beginning its morning sounds, the clang of cook pots, the distant whinny of horses, the low voices of men who had fought beside him at Oxcross, and the whispering would and did not yet know that the ground beneath their war had just shifted in ways none of them could foresee. Robb could hear Great John Umber's laugh from somewhere near the fire line, enormous and uncomplicated, the laugh of a man who had never once questioned whether the king he followed was the right king to follow. Robb thought, Jon doesn't know. He thought, Daenerys Targaryen is across the narrow sea with 3 dragons and an army, and she believes herself the last of her bloodline. He thought, Tywin Lannister has the red wedding in his back pocket. I've known for a month that Walder Frey is wavering, that gold has been moving from Casterly Rock toward the twins. That's something Roose Bolton said at the last war council didn't sit right with any instinct I possess. And now I have this. He thought, Father died for this secret. He went to his knees on the steps of the Great September and confessed to a treason he didn't commit. And they killed him anyway. And the whole time, he was protecting Jon. Gray wind rose from the floor and pressed his enormous head into Robb's chest. Robb set his father's letter down on the cot with the careful reverence of a man setting down something that might shatter, and he buried both hands in the direwolf's fur and held on. He allowed himself that. 1 minute, maybe 2. The grief of it, not only for his father, but for Jon, who had grown up with the bastard's shadow hanging over him, who had gone to the wall because there was nowhere else in Westeros for a man with no name and no rights to make himself something. The grief of it was enormous, and it deserved to be felt. Then he lifted his head, and he looked at his father's handwriting one more time. Do what is right, Robb. Send for Catelyn, he said aloud, to nobody. Then he caught himself. No, not yet. Not her, not first. Her grief would be complicated, would be tangled with 17 years of resenting a secret she'd been kept outside of, and he needed clear counsel before he needed complicated grief. He thought of Edmure, impulsive. He thought of the great John, loyal, but louder than a war drum. He thought of Roose Bolton, and something cold moved through him that had nothing to do with the morning air. He thought of Caitlin again, differently. His mother had loved John, whatever she'd told herself otherwise. And she had known Ned Stark for 30 years. She would know the handwriting. She would know this was real. Sir Reynold, he said, raising his voice just enough to reach the guards outside. Find Lady Stark. Find Lord Glover. Find Howland Reed. He paused. Howland Reed, Lord of Greywater Watch. His father's most private companion. One of only 2 men who had stood in that tower in Dorne and witnessed what happened. There. Find Howland Reed first. Tell him it's urgent. Tell him. He considered. Tell him the raven came from the black cells. He heard the guard's boots on the frozen ground, moving quickly, and he turned back to the letter. The war was still happening. Tywin was still happening. Joffrey sat the Iron Throne in King's Landing, and the Iron Throne sat on a hill of swords that all needed answering. None of that had changed. But the name of the man they were fighting for, that had changed. That had changed entirely. Robb Stark looked at his father's last words and thought about what it meant to be a king who served a greater king, and found, to his own surprise, that the thought did not diminish him at all. In the corner of the tent, the dead raven lay still on the windowsill, its task completed. Grey Wind watched it with no particular interest. Outside, Great John Umber laughed again, and the camp went about its morning. And none of them knew yet that the war had just become something else entirely. If you want to see more stories exploring the roads not taken in Westeros and beyond, hit that subscribe button and drop in the comments the moment. Any moment in the show or the books you most want to see reimagined. All men must die, but legends endure. Howland Reed arrived before the others. He came as he always came, quietly, without announcement, materializing from the camp's morning fog as though the marshes of the neck had simply deposited him wherever he was needed. He was a small man, Howland Reed, smaller than Robb had expected the first time they'd met, smaller than any man who carried the weight he carried had a right to be. His eyes were the color of deep water, and they missed nothing. He looked at Robb's face when he entered the tent, and then he looked at the letter on the cot, and he said nothing for a long moment. You've read it, Howland said. It was not a question. Twice. Robb gestured to the letter. Is it true? Howland Reed crossed the tent in 4 steps and picked up the parchment with the careful hands of a man who had handled fragile things before. He read it standing, as Robb had done, and his face did not change in any way that Robb could measure. When he finished, he set it down again with the same care. And he turned, and he said, yes. One word. But the way he said it, the exhaustion in it, the relief of a man finally setting down a stone he'd carried too long, told Robb everything about the quality of what his father had carried for 17 years. You were there, Robb said. Eddard and I, and one other man who is dead. We climbed the Tower of Joy after the battle. We found her. He stopped. She was already dying. She had lost too much blood. She made Eddard swear, made us both swear, before she would tell us who the father was. She already knew what Robert would do if he found out. She knew what it would mean. He met Robb's eyes steadily. Your father spent the rest of his life making sure it meant nothing, that John could simply live. John doesn't know. No, he's been at the wall for years, taking vows. Thinking himself, Robb stopped, because the full shape of it was still assembling itself in his mind. And it was enormous. John had taken the black, had sworn himself to no land, no lordship, no family, no crown, had made himself a man of the Night's Watch because the Watch was the only place in Westeros where a bastard with no prospects could become something. And the whole time he had been not a bastard, not a Stark bastard, not anyone's bastard. He had been Aegon Targaryen, trueborn son of Rhaegar and Lyanna, the last living product of the most consequential union in Westerosi history. His vows, Robb said. Howland Reed looked at him with those deep-water eyes. Your father wrote a letter. He chose to send it. He chose you, of all people, to receive it. I don't think he would have done that without understanding what it would require of John in the end. The tent flap moved, and Catelyn Stark entered. She saw Howland Reed first, and something flickered across her face, recognition. And then a complicated emotion Robb couldn't quite name. She had known Howland. Reed was one of the men who had been at the Tower of Joy. She had asked Ned about it. Robb knew. More than once over the years. Ned had never told her what happened there. She looked at her son. She looked at his face with the particular precision of a mother who had spent 20 years reading her children. "Show me," she said. He handed her the letter. He watched her read it. He watched her read it a second time, more slowly. And he watched her lips press together into a thin line that he recognized. It was the face she made when she was holding something very large, very still inside herself. Her eyes moved to Howland Reed, and Howland Reed dipped his head, a small but absolute confirmation. And Catelyn closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, they were dry. Whatever she was feeling, she had put it somewhere internal and locked it. "Ned wrote this," she said. "Not a question either." "Yes. He never told me." "No, he told you." This was directed at Howland Reed, with a precision that carried 17 years of questions in it. "I was there, my lady. He had no choice." Catelyn was quiet for a moment. Then, "No, I suppose he didn't." She set the letter down on the cot beside the dead raven, and Robb saw her notice the bird, notice that it had died completing its task, and something in her expression softened almost imperceptibly, before hardening again. "What do you intend to do?" "That's why I called you," Robb said. "And Glover, I need counsel, not just confirmation." "You don't need my counsel on this," Catelyn said, with a flatness that surprised him. "You've already decided. I can see it in your face. You're going to declare for Jon." Robb met her eyes. "He is the rightful king. He is a man who has taken the black," Catelyn said. "His vows are absolute. You cannot simply." The Night's Watch releases men from their vows in extraordinary circumstances. It has been done. Has it? Jon himself was released. He left the Watch after his death and resurrection. Robb stopped. He had been about to say, and his death was its own kind of release. But that was a different timeline, a different story, one that hadn't happened yet and might not need to. The precedent exists. The Watch takes men for life. But life is a flexible term when the realms of men need serving. And what I'm proposing serves the realms of men more than any lord, commander of the Night's Watch ever could. Galbart Glover arrived then, breathing slightly harder than usual. Robb's summons had evidently conveyed urgency and stopped when he felt the quality of silence in the tent. He looked at Robb, at Catelyn, at Howland Reed, at the letter. "Your Grace," he said carefully. "Read it," Robb said, and pushed the letter toward him. Glover read it. He was a practical man, Galbart Glover, a man who had bent the knee to the Starks through 3 generations and whose loyalty was of the uncomplicated northern variety, bone deep and not given to philosophical revision. Robb watched him read it and watched his jaw tighten, and knew the moment he reached the crucial lines. "Gods," Glover said softly. "Yes. Does anyone else? Has this gone beyond this tent?" "No, not yet." Glover set the letter down and looked at Robb with the eyes of a man running calculations. "If you declare for Jon Snow, for the Targaryen, you lose the Karstarks. Rickard Karstark has never forgiven the Lannisters for his sons, but he'll see a Targaryen claim as worse. The Boltons," he stopped. "The Boltons have been communicating with Casterly Rock," Robb said quietly. "I don't know the full shape of it yet, but I know enough to know that Roose Bolton should not be in this tent." Glover stared at him. "You're certain?" "Certain enough." Robb turned to his mother. "That's the other thing Father's letter has given me. If I'm going to do this, if I'm going to reshape this war around a Targaryen claim, I cannot afford the Red Wedding. I cannot afford Walder Frey's betrayal, which I believe is coming. I cannot afford Roose Bolton's knife in my back at a feast. I need to move before Tywin Lannister has time to position his pieces." Catelyn looked at him for a long time. He could see her working through it, the political mathematics, the grief, the complicated love she had always had for Jon, despite everything she'd told herself. The 17 years of silence from her husband finally explained, if not excused. "You'd be giving up your crown," she said finally. "The king in the north. You'd be bending the knee to Jon. I'd be making him what he already is." Robb said, "And yes, I would bend the knee. Willingly." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter but no less certain. The North has said for 1,000 years that we remember, that we honor our debts and our oaths and our dead. If I know what I know and I sit on a throne that belongs to my brother, to my king, then we remember nothing. We're just more southern lords playing the game. The tent was silent. Gray wind padded to the tent's entrance and stood there, looking south, ears forward, as though listening for something none of the humans in the room could hear. Hallen Reed spoke, and his voice carried the weight of a man who had waited 17 years for this exact conversation. Lord Stark chose you, he said. He chose you to carry this. He could have let it die with him. He didn't. That means something. Catelyn looked at her son, this boy who had become a king faster than any boy should have to, who had his father's honor and his mother's practicality, and something uniquely his own that neither of them had managed to name. And she let out a long breath. Then we need to talk about Jaime Lannister, she said. Both men looked at her sharply. He's been our prisoner for months, she said. And he is the one man alive, besides Howland Reed, who might be able to confirm what that letter says. Who was at the Trident? Who knew Rhaegar? Who served in the Kingsguard when Lyanna Stark was taken to Dorne? She met Robb's eyes steadily. You want lords who will never believe a dead man's letter to believe you. Give them a Lannister who has every reason to lie, and doesn't. The morning light shifted through the tent flap, and gray wind turned his great head, and somewhere in the camp a horn sounded the hour, and the war went on around them, unchanged in its machinery but altered entirely in its purpose. Robb Stark picked up his father's letter one more time, and folded it with care, and placed it inside his breast armor, against his heart, where it would remain. Send for the Kingslayer, he said. Jaime Lannister had not been a gracious prisoner. He had been a loud one for the first month, demanding wine and better food and the courtesy owed to a man of his rank, which was considerable, and the courtesy owed to a man of his skill, which was legendary, even with his wrists in chains. He had been a cunning one for the second month, probing every guard rotation for weakness, cataloging every face that came near his cell, filing information, with the systematic patience of a man who had never truly stopped planning. By the third month, he had gone quiet in a way that was somehow worse than either. The silence of a man who had looked at the walls around him and made a private accommodation with his own captivity that no one else was invited to understand. When they brought him before Robb Stark in the war tent, with gray wind at Robb's right and Catelyn and Howland Reed flanking the table, Jaime Lannister looked exactly as a man should not look after months of imprisonment, alert, dangerous, and faintly amused. Your Grace, he said, with a courtesy so precise it managed to be an insult. He looked at Catelyn. My lady. He looked at Howland Reed and paused, just slightly. I don't know you. No, Howland Reed said. You don't. Jaime's eyes moved across the tent with the inventory of a man who had sat in enough war rooms to read the temperature of one. He looked at Robb's face, and something shifted in his expression, not quite wariness, but an adjacent thing, an attentiveness. You're not here to ransom me, he said. No, Robb said, or execute me. A beat, though the morning is young. Sit down, Sir Jaime. They had given him a chair, which was more dignity than some had argued he deserved. He sat in it with the unconscious ease of a man who had always occupied whatever space he was given, as though it had been designed for him specifically. The chains on his wrists clinked once and were still. Robb placed his father's letter on the table between them. Jaime looked at it without touching it. What is this? A letter my father wrote. From the black cells of King's Landing. Before your sister's son had him executed, Robb said. And his voice was even, not cold, not hot, simply even in the way of a man who has already moved through his anger into something more functional. Read it. Jaime looked at him for a moment, and then he picked up the letter and read it. His face did what faces did not, generally, do during this process. It went very still, in a way that was different from the stillness of a man suppressing emotion. It was the stillness of a man recognizing something, confirming something, the way a man's face goes when he is told a truth he already knew and has been waiting 17 years for someone else to speak aloud. He set the letter down. Well, he said. You knew, Robb said. Jaime looked at the letter for another moment. Then he leaned back in his chair and looked at the tense ceiling with an expression of profound, weary irony. I was Lord Commander of the Kingsguard under Aerys Targaryen, he said. I watched Rhaegar ride out to the Trident. I was there when he left. I was there when the reports came back that he had died. He paused. I was not at the Tower of Joy. Ares kept me in King's Landing because he didn't trust me, which was, in retrospect, the wisest thing the man ever did. But I knew Rhaegar. I knew what he had done and what he believed about it. And I knew, he stopped again. And there was something in his face that was not quite grief, but was adjacent to it. The look of a man thinking about someone dead who deserved better than they got. I knew Lyanna Stark was not there against her will, whatever the realm believed. The marriage, Howland Reed said. Can you confirm it? I can confirm that Rhaegar believed it was legal, that he had sought the annulment of his marriage to Elia Martell through channels. That would have satisfied the faith. Whether the documents still exist is another question. He met Robb's eyes. Your father found them? He says so, hidden where he does not name in the letter. Jaime was quiet for a moment. Old Town, he said. If I were hiding documents of that kind, it would be Old Town. The Citadel has records that even the Crown cannot compel them to surrender. Rhaegar spent time there, in his youth. He had contacts among the Archmesters. He looked at the letter again. The boy, Jon Snow, has he been told? No, Robb said. He's at the Wall. The Wall. Jaime absorbed this. The heir to the Iron Throne is a sworn brother of the Night's Watch. The Night's Watch releases men from their vows when the Lord Commander grants it. Yes, I'm aware of the precedent. I've studied more military law than you might expect of a man with my reputation. He looked at Robb with something that was beginning, cautiously, to look like genuine engagement. What do you want from me, Your Grace? You haven't brought me here for confirmation. You have Reed, and you have your father's letter, and you have your own certainty, which is written all over your face. You want something else. Robb met his gaze. I want you to stand before my lords and say what you just said to me. Jaime blinked. It was the first genuinely surprised thing Robb had seen him do. You want a Lannister to legitimize a Targaryen claim. I want the man who killed the last Targaryen king to explain why the son of the prince he served deserves the throne his father died reaching for. Robb paused. Your testimony would carry weight that no Stark letter ever could. Every lord in the North and the Riverlands knows that a Lannister has no reason to support a Targaryen claim. It works against every interest your family holds, which is precisely why they'll believe it. Jaime stared at him. Something was moving behind his green eyes. Calculations. Certainly, but also something less cynical. Something that Robb suspected Jaime Lannister did not often allow to surface. He had killed a king to save 500,000 lives and received nothing for it but contempt and a name he would carry to his grave. Robb was offering him something different, and they both understood what it was, even if neither of them named it. My freedom, Jaime said, because he was the kind of man who named things. Your freedom, and more than that, a chance to be the man who helped seat the rightful king, instead of the man who killed the wrong one. Jaime laughed, a short, sharp sound, not unkind. You're either the most naive king I've ever encountered or the most calculating one. And your father raised you. So I'm genuinely uncertain which. He looked at Catelyn. Lady Stark, you've been very quiet. Catelyn regarded him with the clear, steady eyes of a woman who had made her peace with difficult decisions. I released you once before and was overruled, she said. I am not proposing to repeat that. My son is proposing something more useful than your release. He is proposing your redemption. Jaime looked at her for a long moment. That's an extraordinary thing, he said, to offer a Lannister. The North deals in extraordinary things, Catelyn said, when it must. The silence stretched. Gray wind had moved, silently as smoke, to stand directly beside Jaime's chair, and sat looking up at the Kingslayer, with amber eyes that held no particular malice and no particular warmth, only the specific, focused attention of a creature that was making a judgment. Jaime looked down at the direwolf. The direwolf looked up at Jaime. He's deciding whether to trust me, Jaime said. He's decided faster than I have, Robb said. Something shifted in Jaime Lannister's face, something old and tired and quietly surprised. He looked at the letter on the table between them. He looked at Robb Stark, who was 19 years old and carrying a war, and his dead father's secret and the weight of a throne that didn't belong to him and was choosing to give it away, was choosing freely to give it away, and who met his eyes without flinching. I should tell you, Jaime said more quietly. That Cersei will try to have you killed the moment she learns of this. That my father will move faster than you think possible to counter anything you attempt politically. That the Freys are already bought, and the Boltons are already leaning, and the Karstarks will fracture before winter. I know, Robb said, and you're proceeding anyway. My father went to his death to protect a secret that would have saved him if he'd spoken it, Robb said. I am not going to sit on a borrowed throne and pretend. I didn't read his last words. Jaime Lannister looked at him for a long moment, with the expression of a man encountering something he had genuinely not expected to encounter. A Stark who understood the cost of what he was doing and was doing it anyway. Not out of naivety, but out of something older and harder than naivety. He reached out and picked up his father's letter, and folded it, and handed it back to Robb. When do I speak? He said. The lords came to Riverrun's great hall like weather, arriving in fronts, carrying their own atmospheres. Robb had given them 3 days' notice. Enough time for the ravens to fly to the nearest camps, but not enough time for word to reach King's Landing or Casterly Rock. 3 days was the precise width of the window he had calculated. Wide enough for the necessary men to gather, narrow enough that Tywin Lannister could not receive intelligence and respond before the thing was done. He had learned that much from his father's mistakes, not the content of the decisions his father had made, which had been mostly right, but the timing, which had been fatally generous. Ned Stark had always given his enemies time to react. Robb intended to be less courteous. They came. The great Jon, massive and loud as a thunderstorm, who had named Robb king in the first place and whose relationship with the concept of a different king was going to be the first and most significant test of the morning. Midge Mormont, Lady of Bear Island, whose family had served the Starks since before living memory and whose granite face gave nothing away on arrival. Galbart Glover, who already knew, and whose controlled expression was itself a kind of information management. Jason Mallister, sharp-eyed and watchful. Edmure Tully, Catelyn's brother, who had arrived with the defensive bearing of a man who suspected he was about to be surprised and did not enjoy surprises. And Roose Bolton. Roose Bolton arrived last, which was either coincidence or the particular kind of social precision that Bolton specialized in. The man who enters a room after everyone else has settled, who reads the assembled faces before contributing his own. He was pale and quiet in the way of deep water that conceals its own depth, and his eyes moved across the hall with the unhurried inventory of a man who was always in every room, counting exits. Robb watched him arrive and kept his own face still. He had not told Bolton what the gathering was for. He had not told the Karstarks either, but the Karstarks were 2 days ride and could not make it in time, which was not entirely accidental. Jaime Lannister stood to Robb's left, which had produced the exact reaction Robb had anticipated. A visible ripple of confusion and anger through the assembled lords. Several hands dropping to sword hilts before remembering they were in a hall under guest right. Great Jon Umber's voice rising above the general murmur with a specificity that could be heard from the back of the room. Why in the 7 hells is the Kingslayer unchained and standing at your shoulder? Your Grace. Because I need him here, Robb said. You'll understand why before I'm done. He let them settle. He let the discomfort breathe for a moment, because discomfort made men listen. Then he spoke. He spoke plainly, which was the only way he knew how to speak in moments that mattered. He told them about the raven. He told them about the letter, and he held it up so they could see the handwriting, Ned Stark's handwriting, which most of them recognized, and several of them leaned forward involuntarily at the sight of it. The physical evidence of a dead man's voice. He told them what it said, and he told them that Howland Reed, who stood to his right and whom half the room recognized as Eddard Stark's most trusted companion from the war that had put Robert Baratheon on the throne, had confirmed every word of it. The silence that followed was not the silence of men who had nothing to say. It was the silence of men recalibrating. Great Jon Umber spoke first, because Great Jon Umber always spoke first. Jon Snow is a bastard, he said, with the particular certainty of a man stating a fact so obvious it embarrassed him to have to say it. Everyone knows he's a bastard. Lord Eddard's bastard. No offense to the dead. Lord Eddard's secret, Robb said. Not his blood. Jon Snow is Aegon Targaryen. trueborn son of Prince Rhaegar and Lyanna Stark, conceived in lawful marriage and hidden for 17 years to protect him from Robert Baratheon's hatred of the Targaryen name. My father carried this truth to his grave. He chose to send it to me before he died. He paused. He did not do so lightly. He never did anything lightly. Another silence. Then Edmure Tully, with the expression of a man who wished he were somewhere simpler. And if the letter is real, and the claim is real, what are you proposing, Robb? Because you are the king in the north. The lords of the north and the Riverlands crowned you. What you're describing would unseat me, Robb said clearly. Yes, that is what I'm proposing. I am proposing to bend the knee to the rightful king of the Seven Kingdoms, who is my brother by every bond except blood, and my king by blood whether I acknowledged it or not. The room erupted. He let it. There was no managing what happened next. The Grachan's outrage, which was sincere and enormous and expressed at a volume that rattled the torches in their sconces. Midge Mormont's rapid, quiet consultation with Galbart Glover. Edmure's visible internal collapse as he tried to calculate what this meant for House Tully's political position. Jason Mallister, going very still in the manner of a man who was listening to everything and committing it to memory. And Roose Bolton, who did not react at all. Robb watched Bolton's face during the eruption and saw precisely nothing. No surprise, no anger, no recalibration. Just the same pale, watchful stillness. The stillness of a man who had already known something like this might be coming, which was not possible unless Bolton's communication with Casterly Rock had been more comprehensive than Robb had understood, unless someone had leaked the nature of the Raven's arrival, unless he filed it later. The conversation with Bolton was for later, and it would not be a conversation that Bolton expected. When the noise had subsided to a manageable level, Robb nodded to Jaime Lannister. Jaime stepped forward. He did it with the precise, unhurried confidence of a man who had stood before hostile audiences his entire life and found them, on the whole, less dangerous than they believed themselves to be. He looked at the assembled lords of the North and the Riverlands with green eyes that were not apologetic and not aggressive, simply direct. I'll keep this brief, Jaime said, because I'm aware that several of you would like to kill me and long speeches. Give a man time to talk himself out of a decision he's already made. He looked at the great Jon, who was indeed eyeing him with the expression of a man reviewing options. I served Aerys Targaryen. I served Rhaegar Targaryen before that, as a squire, and I knew him. I knew what he believed about Lyanna Stark. I knew that what he had done in the Targaryen tradition of following prophecy and destiny into places other men would not go. Whether he was right to do it is not my argument here. I'm not here to defend Rhaegar. I'm here to tell you what I know. He paused. Jon Snow has his father's eyes, Jaime said. I did not know this until your king told me this morning, because I have not seen Jon Snow since he was an infant. In a tower in Dorne, 3 days old, wrapped in a Stark cloak. A beat. I was not there, but I know the men who were. Howland Reed is one of them, and he is standing in this room. Lord Eddard Stark was another, and he is dead. And the letter you have just heard read to you is his testimony. I have no reason to support a Targaryen claim. My family's interests are directly opposed to a Targaryen restoration. My sister sits beside the Iron Throne. My father commands the armies that would need to be defeated to put a Targaryen king in power. If I am standing here confirming this, it is not because I benefit from it. He let them look at him. Let them weigh his face, his name, his history. It is because it's true, he said. And I find, at this particular point in my life, that truth is one of the few currencies I have left that's worth anything. The silence that followed was different from the first. One, quieter, more interior. Midge Mormont spoke, and her voice had the quality of millstone, slow, heavy, and capable of grinding anything placed beneath it. How do we get Jon Snow to the wall to hear this? And how do we convince him to leave it? We send a raven, Robb said. And we send it from me, not from a stranger. He'll come because I'm asking him, and he'll understand why when he reads what I've written. And if he refuses? Jason Mallister asked. He won't, Robb said, with the quiet certainty of a man who had grown up with someone for 15 years and knew the precise shape of their honor. Jon Snow has spent his entire life believing he owed a debt, to the realm because of what he was. When he learns what he actually is, the debt he'll feel will be larger, not smaller. He won't walk away from it. He's a Stark. He said it simply, and it landed simply. And several of the older lords in the room, men who had served Eddard Stark and known what that name meant, straightened almost imperceptibly. Roose Bolton's face remained still as winter water. Greatjon Umber slammed his enormous fist on the table, and every cup in the hall jumped. And he said, "If Lord Eddard swore it, and Howland Reed swears it, and the bloody Kingslayer swears it, then I'll be damned if I'm the man who calls them all liars." He looked at Robb with an expression of complex northern emotion, pride and grief and stubbornness all braided together. "You're a better man than most kings I've heard of, boy. Giving up a crown because it's right." He shook his head. "Stupid as your father, too." Robb smiled, the first real smile he had managed in 3 days. "I'll take that." The meeting continued for another 2 hours, through objections and questions and the specific kind of North Riverland's political argument that sounded like two men threatening each other while technically agreeing. Robb managed it with a patience that surprised even him, answering what could be answered and acknowledging what could not. Through all of it, Roose Bolton sat and said very little, and watched everything, and Robb felt the man's silence like a cold finger between his shoulder blades, a constant, specific pressure that had a name. He wasn't ready to speak aloud yet. When the hall emptied, Robb asked Galbart Glover to stay. "Bolton," Robb said, when the door had closed. Glover nodded slowly. "I saw it too. No surprise. A man learns something like that. Something that reshapes the entire war, and he doesn't react." Robb looked at the table where the letter still lay. Unless he already knew something was coming. Not this specifically, but something. "What do you want to do?" Robb was quiet for a moment, looking at the letter. His father had written it in a black cell with failing hands, and it had already changed more than Ned Stark could have imagined it would. He thought about what his father would have done, and then he thought about what his father's way of doing things had cost him, and he chose differently. "Watch him," Robb said, "closely, and say nothing. I want Bolton to believe that his position here is secure, right up until the moment I need it not to be." He paused. "Now, we write to Jon." The wall was older than the word for cold. Jon Snow had learned this in his first winter at Castle Black, when the wind came down from the haunted forest with a patience that had nothing human in it, not the patience of a man waiting for something, but the patience of a thing that had never needed to wait because it had never needed anything at all. The wall simply was, as it had always been, 800 feet of ice that remembered every war fought beneath it and kept its counsel about all of them. Jon kept his counsel too, these days. It was easier at the wall than it had been anywhere else. He was reading dispatches in the Lord Commander's Tower when the Raven came, not the thin, administrative correspondence of castle logistics, not the careful coded language of the watches, relations with the wildlings beyond, but a letter sealed with gray wax stamped with a direwolf so precisely rendered that he felt it in his chest. Before he had broken the seal, he knew Robb's seal. He had watched it pressed into 100 boyhood letters, back when letters between Winterfell and Castle Black were simple things, about horses and training and whether the harvest would be good. He broke it and read it standing, as men seemed to do when they received letters that mattered. He read it 3 times. Then he sat down on the floor of the Lord Commander's Tower, which was not dignified, and Ghost came and pressed a massive white head against his shoulder. And Jon Snow read his brother's letter a 4th time and tried to find the place inside himself where feelings were kept and discovered that it was very full and very loud and completely inaccessible. "You are not who you think you are. You never were. And I am sorry that you are." Hearing this from a letter instead of from our father's mouth. "But our father is dead, and he left this truth to me, and I am leaving it to you, because it belongs to you more than it has ever belonged to anyone else. Your name is Aegon. Your father was Rhaegar Targaryen. Your mother was Lyanna Stark, and she loved you. And she died 3 days after you were born in a tower in Dorne. And the last thing she did was make our father promise to keep you safe. He kept that promise for 17 years. He kept it all the way to the block. I am keeping it now in the only way I can, by telling you the truth, and by asking you to come south, and by telling you that I have already bent the knee in my heart to the king you are, whether you choose to accept it or not. Come home, Jon." Not to Winterfell. Winterfell is gone. And we'll rebuild it together. Come to Riverrun. Come and hear what Howland Reed has to say. And what Jaime Lannister has to say. And then make your choice with full knowledge of what you're choosing. That's all I'm asking. One choice, with open eyes. Your brother. Always your brother. Robb. Jon sat on the floor for a long time. Ghost sat with him, immovable and warm. And the wall groaned outside in the wind. That deep structural sound it made in cold weather. Ice settling against ice. The noise of something enormous making peace with its own weight. And Jon thought about his father's face on the steps of the great September of Baelor, kneeling in defeat, confessing to treason he had not committed. He thought about the way Ned Stark had always looked at him, with love, certainly, absolute and unflinching, but also with something that Jon had always half-consciously interpreted as guilt, and had never understood why. He understood now. He understood the careful distance his father had always maintained, the way he had never quite answered certain questions, the way his face had gone still and opaque whenever Jon had asked about his mother. He understood the watch, why his father had not only permitted it but quietly encouraged it, why a life of vows and anonymity beyond the wall had seemed, to Ned Stark, like a reasonable future for a boy who needed to be invisible. He had been kept safe the only way his father knew how to keep him safe, by making him nobody. He had been nobody for 20-some years, and he had made a life of it. And it had been, he searched for the word, it had been real. Every oath he had taken was real. Every man he had led was real. Every White Walker he had faced beyond the wall was real. Mance Rayder was real, and Ygritte was real. And the army of the dead that he had watched march past, Hardhome in numbers beyond counting, was real. And the threat they represented was real, and it was real right now. Tonight, with winter pressing down on the wall from the north with a patience that made Robb's war seem like something happening very far away and very fast. He went to find Samwell Tarly. Sam was in the library, which was where Sam was always found when the world became difficult, surrounded by books in the particular way of a man who had discovered early that books were less dangerous than people and had never entirely recovered from the relief of it. He looked up when Jon entered and saw Jon's face and put his book down. What happened? Sam said. Jon handed him the letter. Sam read it with the expression of a man watching something enormous approach from a very long distance, growing understanding, and underneath it a kind of awe that was not quite comfortable. When he finished, he looked up at Jon with eyes that were wide and very serious. Jon, he said, I know. This means you're. I know, Sam. The Iron Throne. Sam closed his mouth. He looked at the letter again, then at Jon, then at his books, as though the books might offer some precedent. The Night's Watch vows, he said carefully. There's a question of whether a man can be released from vows when. I died, Jon said flatly. I was killed by my own brothers, and I came back. I've thought about whether that released me from my vows before. I've thought about it more than I've admitted. He sat down across from Sam. The question isn't whether I can leave the watch. The question is whether I should. The dead, Sam said softly. He meant the army of them, north of the wall. The one thing they had both seen that most men south of the wall still refused to believe was real. The dead, Jon agreed. The dead are coming, Sam. I have seen them. I have fought them. I have watched the Night King raise men at Hardhome without touching them, without a word, just lifting his arms. And every body on that beach stood up again. He paused. If I go south, if I go and be whatever Robb needs me to be, whatever this truth requires of me, I leave the watch without a Lord Commander who knows what's coming. I leave the North without its only informed voice on the question of what lies beyond the wall. But if you stay, Sam said carefully, in the voice he used when he was working through an argument he was not sure he should be making, you leave the realm without its rightful king during a war that is tearing it apart. And a torn realm can't fight the dead. It can't mount the kind of defense that. He stopped. Jon, the dragonglass, Valyrian steel. We need the whole realm, or at least most of it, pulling in one direction, with resources behind it. A unified realm under a king people will actually follow. People don't know who I am. They will, Sam said, if Robb tells them. He looked at Jon steadily. He's already told his lords. The Kingslayer is testifying. Howland Reed is testifying. Jon, this is, the Raven flew. The thing is already in motion. The question isn't whether to stop it. The question is whether you're in the room when the decisions get made. Jon looked at his hands. He had Ghost's white fur on his fingers, and a Lord Commander's, calluses on his palms, and a king's. Blood in his veins that he had not asked for and could not give back. I'll need to convene the senior officers, he said finally. Sam exhaled. Yes. I'll need to name an interim commander. Someone who knows what's north of the wall. Not just someone politically convenient. Jon looked at the window, through which the wall was visible as a luminous white mass in the moonlight. Vast and ancient and indifferent. Ed Tollett. He knows. He was at Hardhome. He was, Sam agreed. And we need to send ravens south. Not just to Robb. To every lord with a castle that has a harbor or a mine or a stockpile of obsidian. The dragonglass deposits in Dragonstone. He stopped himself. Dragonstone was Daenerys Targaryen's seat. And Daenerys Targaryen was, apparently, his aunt, which was a thought so large and strange that he was going to need to set it aside. For now, or it would swallow him. He stood. Ghost stood with him. There's something else, he said. He had been building to it since sitting down. And he said it now with the specific directness of a man who has decided that the time for indirect things has passed. In the letter, Robb says Daenerys will hear about this, that a raven is going east. Yes, Sam said cautiously. She has dragons, Jon said. 3 of them, and an army, and a claim, and 17 years of exile, making her believe she is the last of her bloodline. He met Sam's eyes. What happens to a person who has built their entire identity around being the last of something when they discover they're not? Sam thought about it with the seriousness the question deserved. It depends, he said finally, on whether what they built their identity around was the being last or the being Targaryen. Jon nodded slowly. It was, he thought, exactly the right way to frame it, and exactly the thing he would not know until he met her. And he found, surprisingly, despite everything, despite the weight of the night and the wall and the dead and the crown he had not asked for, he found that he wanted to meet her, wanted to look at someone else who had grown up carrying a false name in a world that would have killed them for their true one. He picked up Robb's letter from the table and folded it with care. Tell Ed I need to speak with him, he said. And Sam, he paused at the door. Ghost was already beside him, white as snow and twice as quiet. Thank you. For all of it. For every book you read, and everything you figured out before I did. Sam looked slightly pink around the ears, in the way he did when he was genuinely moved and trying not to show it. You'd have gotten there, he said. Eventually, Jon said. At great cost to everyone. He went out into the walls cold, and Ghost went with him. And above them the ice groaned its ancient groan. And south of them a war was reshaping itself around a name that had been hidden for 17 years. And north of them something vast and cold and patient was moving through the dark with the certainty of a thing that had never doubted its own victory. Jon Snow, Aegon Targaryen, looked north for a long moment, at the darkness beyond the wall. Then he turned south. The twins squatted over the green fork like something that had grown there, rather than been built. 2 gray towers connected by a bridge that Walder Frey had spent 80 years treating as the most valuable piece of stone in Westeros, which, in the particular geography of the Riverlands, it nearly was. No army crossed the Green Fork at this point without Walder Frey's permission. No army had, in living memory, tested what happened if they tried. Robb Stark arrived at the twins with a different army than the one Walder Frey had expected. He arrived with fewer men, a deliberate choice, because fewer men read as confidence rather than threat, and because the men he brought were the ones he trusted, which was a shorter list than it had been 3 months ago. He arrived without Roose Bolton, who had been given a tactical assignment 2 days ride east that was legitimate enough to be unquestionable and inconvenient enough to keep him occupied. He arrived with Jaime Lannister riding openly in his company, unchained, which was the kind of detail that would reach Walder Frey's ears before Robb reached the gate, and which was intended to. He arrived knowing about the gold. The intelligence had come from Tyrion Lannister. Indirectly, a chain of information that had traveled from King's Landing through Varys's network to a contact in Riverrun, compressed into a message so brief it barely counted as one. Frey has been approached. The price is your head and the young wolf's crown. Tywin is patient, but the gold has already moved. It had been signed with a mockingbird's feather pressed into wax, which told Robb something about Littlefinger's own games that he filed without fully understanding yet. What it told him about the twins was enough. Walder Frey met them in the Great Hall, surrounded by the innumerable Frey offspring that Robb had always found faintly overwhelming, sons and grandsons, and natural sons and sons of grandsons, all wearing variations of the same watchful expression, as though they had been issued it along with the Frey name. Walder himself was ancient and shrewd, and wrapped in furs against a cold that had not yet fully arrived, his eyes moving over Robb's party with the inventory of a man pricing things. They moved to Robb's party and stopped on Jaime Lannister. "Well," Walder Frey said, in the voice of a man who had lived long enough to be surprised by very few things and was currently being surprised. "The Kingslayer, Lord Frey," Jaime said, with the courteous neutrality of a man who found the phrase beneath active contempt, but was being paid to be civil. "Interesting company you're keeping, Your Grace." Walder's eyes moved back to Robb with the slow deliberation of a tortoise that had outlived everything that had ever tried to eat it. "Last I heard, the Kingslayer was your prisoner." "He's my witness," Robb said. "We'll get to that. First, I'd like to speak with you privately, my lord. There are things you should hear before your household hears them." Walder Frey looked at him for a long moment with eyes that had watched 3 kings come and go and had profited from every transition. He was not a sentimental man, Walder Frey, and he was not an honorable one, and he had made his peace with both facts in the first decade of his life and never revisited the question. He was, however, a practical man, and practical men recognized when the shape of a conversation was different from the shape they had anticipated. "Clear the hall," he said. They sat across from each other at the long table, Robb, Catelyn, and Howland Reed on one side, Walder Frey and his eldest remaining son, Ser Stevrin, on the other. And Robb laid the situation out with the same plainness he had used at Riverrun, though calibrated differently. He was not appealing to Walder Frey's honor, which did not exist in any form Robb could identify. He was appealing to something more reliable, Walder Frey's sense of which way the wind was turning. He told him about the letter. He told him about Howland Reed's confirmation and Jaime Lannister's testimony. He told him about Jon Snow riding south from the Wall, and about the ravens sent east across the narrow sea, and about the particular political mathematics of what happened when the North, the Rivellins, and potentially Daenerys Targaryen's armies all aligned behind a single claim that was, by every measure of law and blood and marriage, legitimate. Then he placed a piece of information on the table that was not in the letter and not in any raven that had flown openly. "I know about the gold," Robb said. Walder Frey went very still. "I know Tywin Lannister has paid you," Robb continued, in the same even tone. "I know what he paid you to do. I know the date he proposed and the guest list he suggested and the particular method he recommended." He paused. "I know because Tywin Lannister's network has a gap in it that he doesn't know about yet, and information flows through that gap to people who are not his allies." This was partially true. The information had come through Varys, which meant it had come through a gap that Varys controlled, which meant Robb was, knowingly, holding intelligence that originated with the Spider, a man whose ultimate allegiances remained as opaque as deep water. He had considered this complication and decided that the information's truth mattered more than its source, at least for now. Walder Frey looked at him with eyes that had gone from watchful to something more careful. "You're saying you know I've been bought," he said. "I'm saying I know you've been approached," Robb said. "Whether you've been bought is a question only you can answer, and I'm giving you the opportunity to answer it before anyone else is in the room." The silence stretched. Stevrin Frey looked at his father with an expression of concentrated blankness that was itself communicative, the face of a man who knew better than to have a visible opinion. "What are you offering?" Walder said finally. It was the question of a practical man who had recognized that the negotiation had moved to a different table. "Robb Stark isn't offering you anything," Robb said. "Robb Stark is a man surrendering his crown in favor of the rightful king. But the man who comes after the king, whose claim is already being assembled across the north and the Riverlands, that king will need lords who crossed the Green Fork for him, lords whose crossing meant something, lords whose castles sit on every significant river route in the Riverlands. He met Walder's ancient eyes steadily. History remembers which side of a turning point men chose. You've lived long enough to know that. Walder Frye was quiet for a very long time. Outside the hall, the Green Fork moved with its usual indifference, carrying whatever the Riverlands gave it southward without comment. A cold wind came through the high windows and made the torches lean. My granddaughter, Walder said finally. Rosalind, she's a good girl. Better than most of what I've produced. He looked at Robb with a frankness that was almost startling from a man so practiced in concealment. I was promised a marriage alliance. The marriage didn't happen. He waved a hand. I know whose fault that was. I'm not a fool. But the slight stood. He paused. I want the slight addressed. Not the marriage. That ship has obviously sailed, but the slight. A formal acknowledgement from the new king that house phrase loyalty during the transition is recognized and valued. Land, title, something that lasts beyond the current arrangement. I can't promise what a king I don't yet speak for will give you. Robb said honestly. What I can promise is that I will advocate for it. In person, to John's face. And John listens to me. Does he? He always has. Robb allowed himself a small pause. We're brothers. Walder Frye made a sound that might have been a laugh in a younger man. He looked at Caitlin, who had been silent throughout with the composed expression of a woman, managing her reaction to being in the same room as the man who had been preparing to murder her son. Lady Stark, he said. You're quieter than I remember. I'm listening, Caitlin said. It's something I've found more useful than talking in recent months. Walder looked at her for a moment with something that was not quite respect, but was adjacent to it, the recognition of one pragmatist for another. He turned back to Robb. The gold Tywin sent, he said. It's in my vault. I know, Robb said. It would be a shame to return it. Keep it, Robb said. Consider it a contribution to the cost of hosting an army's crossing. He let that settle. I'll need the bridge, Lord Frye, not as a gift, as a choice. Your choice, made openly, in front of your household. So there's no question later about which way House Frye stood when the wind changed. Another silence. Walder Frye looked at his son, Stevrin Frye, who had been waiting with practiced stillness. Gave his father the most minimal nod Robb had ever seen, barely a shift of the chin. But Walder read it the way old men read the things they'd trained themselves to read. Ser Stevrin will arrange the crossing, Walder said. You'll dine with us tonight. Proper guest right. Bread and salt. He said the last two words with a deliberate emphasis that carried their full weight, the ancient sacred covenant of hospitality that even Walder Frye, in this version of events, was not prepared to violate. In the morning, your army crosses. Robb Stark reached across the table and clasped the old man's hand. It was not a warm gesture on either side, but it was a real one. That night, in the chamber they gave him in the East Tower, Robb wrote 2 letters. The first was to John, telling him the twins were secured and the Riverlands Road was open. The second was to Roose Bolton, recalling him from his Eastern assignment with the carefully worded courtesy of a man who had decided exactly how to manage a snake, not by killing it, which would alert every other snake in the vicinity, but by removing it from the place where it could do the most harm. He sealed both letters with his dire wolf seal and gave them to the maester. Then he stood at the window and looked at the bridge over the Green Fork. The bridge that was, tonight, still standing, and would be standing in the morning, and would carry his army south toward whatever came next. And he thought about his father's handwriting, and about the red wedding that had not happened, and about how thin the margin was between the history that had almost been and the history that was still being made. The torchlight on the water below looked, for a moment, almost like fire. The raven reached Dragonstone before it reached Daenerys. This was not unusual. Ravens had a way of arriving at destinations before the people those destinations belonged to, depositing their messages with whatever steward or maester happened to be present, so that news waited in written form for the person it most concerned, which was its own particular cruelty. But in this case the delay was longer than most, because Daenerys Targaryen was not at Dragonstone when the raven arrived. She was 2 miles offshore on the deck of a ship, watching her dragons hunt, which was something she did in the early mornings when the weight of being the rightful queen of everything became briefly heavier than she could carry in a room. Drogon was the one she watched. He was always the one she watched, black against the gray dawn sky, enormous and absolute, banking over the water with the unhurried precision of something that had never in its life been required to hurry, because nothing in its life had ever been faster than it. Regal and Viserion hunted further east, their scales catching the first light, green and gold against the narrow sea's cold expanse. 3 dragons, her children, the thing that made her real in a world that had spent 17 years treating her as a ghost. Missandei brought the raven's message to her on deck. It came 2 days ago, Missandei said. Maester Pylus held it because he wasn't certain. She paused. He wasn't certain of the appropriate response. Daenerys looked at the seal. The direwolf. Northern wax, gray-pressed. The kind of seal that came from a man who had learned the habit of formality from generations of lords who treated letters as legally binding. She broke it and read it, standing at the ship's rail with the sea wind pulling at her silver hair and Drogon's shadow passing over the deck as he made a low banking turn above them. The letter was from Robb Stark. She had heard of him, the young wolf, the king in the north, the boy who had been cutting through Lannister armies like something that couldn't be stopped, right up until the moment everyone had assumed he would be stopped. She had been watching his war with the particular attention of a woman who had her own wars to manage and recognize competence in others as a resource worth tracking. The letter was not what she had expected. She read it twice, and then she looked at Missandei, and Missandei looked back at her with the composed attentiveness that meant she was prepared for any response, including the ones that weren't words. "Leave me," Daenerys said. "Gently, please." Missandei went. Daenerys stood at the rail and looked at the sea and held the letter in both hands and felt something move through her that she did not immediately have a name for. It was large and cold and not entirely unpleasant, in the way that very large cold things sometimes aren't. The shock of winter water that first clears the mind before the pain of it arrives. There was another Targaryen. She had been the last. She had built herself around that fact with the deliberateness of an architect who knows the foundation is the only thing standing between the building and the earth. The last dragon, the last of her blood, the girl who had survived Viserys and the Dothraki and the slavers and the politics of 3 cities and 1,000 smaller deaths, because she was the last, and the last had to survive because there was no one else. The identity was not incidental. It was load-bearing. And now Robb Stark was telling her that her brother Rhaegar had had a son who was alive, a son who was at the wall or riding south from it, a son who was, by every law of succession that Targaryen dynasties had ever recognized, ahead of her in the line of inheritance, because he was male and trueborn and the son of the crown prince, while she was female and the daughter of the king. And Westerosi succession law, in its infuriating way, would place him above her, regardless of the 17 years she had spent earning what she was. She thought he could be a lie. She thought Robb Stark has no obvious reason to lie about this. She thought a Stark killed. He surrendered his crown. He bent the knee to a man he'd never met because his father's letter told him to. She thought, what kind of man does that? She thought, what kind of man was raised to do that? Drogon landed on the ship's prow with a force that made the whole vessel shudder, folding his wings with the particular satisfaction of a creature returning to where it belonged. He turned his enormous head toward her and regarded her with one eye. That vertical pupil, that depthless orange gaze, that attention which was not human and not animal, but something older than both. She walked to him and put her hand on the ridge of his jaw, and he made the low sound he made when she touched him. And she stood there, for a moment with her hand on her dragon, and tried to think clearly. He is my nephew, she thought, and the word felt strange. She had no reference for it. She had never had a nephew. She had barely had a family. She had had Viserys, who had been simultaneously her only protection and her greatest threat. And she had had Ser Jorah, who had loved her and betrayed her and been forgiven and been sent away. And she had had Missandei and Grey Worm and Barristan before his death. And she had had the dragons, who were hers in a way that nothing human had ever been entirely hers. And now there was a nephew. She went back to the letter and read it a third time, more slowly. Robb Stark was precise in his language, in the way of a man who had been taught to be careful with words. not ornate, not political, simply exact. He told her what the letter said. He told her what Howland Reed had confirmed and what Jaime Lannister had testified. He told her about the documents that might exist in Old Town. He told her about Jon's vows and Jon's decision to ride south. And he told her, and this was the part she read most carefully, he told her that Jon did not know she existed in any personal sense, that he knew her name and her dragons and her wars, but he knew them the way anyone in Westeros knew them, from reports, from ravens, from the specific distance of someone watching an extraordinary thing happen to someone else. He has not had time, Robb wrote, to form an opinion of you that is based on anything other than reputation. I would ask you to extend him the same courtesy. It was, she thought, a remarkably direct thing to say to a queen. It assumed she might be inclined to prejudge. It assumed she had the capacity not to. Both assumptions were accurate, and the fact that Robb Stark had made them, without apology, suggested that he understood her better than most men who had never met her. She called for Tyrion. He arrived with his characteristic promptness. Tyrion had a gift for being nearby when things happened, which was either a product of his intelligence or his wine consumption. And Daenerys had long since stopped trying to determine which. And he read the letter with the expression of a man encountering something he had been half expecting for some time. When he finished, he poured himself a drink from somewhere, which was a reflex, and looked at Daenerys with his mismatched eyes. Well, he said. Your thoughts, she said. My thoughts are several and somewhat contradictory, which is their usual condition. He set the drink down without having touched it, which meant he was genuinely engaged. The claim is almost certainly legitimate. Rhaegar, I knew Rhaegar slightly, in the way that a Lannister child at court knew a Targaryen prince, which is to say I observed him from a distance and formed impressions that I later revised. He was capable of exactly this kind of thing. The secret marriage, the tower, the prophecy driving him toward it. It has his shape. And the man himself? Jon Snow. Tyrion was quiet for a moment. I met him, he said, briefly, at Winterfell, when I rode north to the Wall years ago. He searched for words. He was Ned Stark's son, in all the ways that mattered. Quiet. Principled. The kind of principled that's going to get him killed if he doesn't learn to be flexible, which, given that he's apparently willing to come south and press a claim he never asked for, perhaps he's learning. He paused. He's not you, Your Grace. No, Daenerys said. He hasn't spent 17 years building toward this. He hasn't built anything toward this. The crown is being handed to him by a brother who loves him, and he's going to spend the first year of his kingship, if it comes to that, completely unprepared for what the crown actually requires. He looked at her steadily, which means the question isn't really whether his claim supersedes yours. The question is what kind of king he'll be, and whether that king is better served by an ally or an opponent. Daenerys looked at the letter. She looked at Drogon, who had settled into the ship's prow and was watching her with that ancient, alien attention. There is also, Tyrion said carefully, the question of the White Walkers. She looked at him sharply. Robb Stark mentions them in passing, Tyrion said. The army of the dead, beyond the wall. He treats it as an established fact rather than a rumor, which suggests Jon Snow has briefed him comprehensively. We've had reports, fragmentary, easily dismissed, but consistent, and growing more consistent. If the threat is real, Daenerys said, then 3 dragons are not a luxury. They are the only weapon that matters. Yes, Tyrion said, which is another argument for the alliance question rather than the succession question. He met her eyes. You could contest his claim. You have grounds, and you have armies, and you have dragons, and you would win. Or, he paused, you could go and meet your nephew, and decide what you think of him as a man, and determine whether the 7 kingdoms are better served by 1 Targaryen on a throne or 2 Targaryens facing the same direction. Daenerys was quiet for a long moment. The ship moved beneath her with the patient rhythm of deep water. Drogon shifted on the prow and spread one wing briefly against the dawn, as though testing the air. She thought about what it meant to have built herself around being the last. She thought about whether the building still stood if the foundation changed. She thought about Rhaegar, whom she had never met, who had died at the Trident before she was born, who had given her everything she had, through the specific chain of cause and effect that his choices had set in motion. and who had, apparently, left her a nephew in a tower in Dorne. She thought, he has her eyes. Robb Stark says he has Stark coloring but Targaryen eyes. She thought, I want to see his eyes. We sail for Dragonstone, she said. And from Dragonstone we send our own Raven north. She folded Robb Stark's letter with care. Tell him I will meet his brother. Tell him I will listen. Tell him, she paused, and the pause was precise. Tell him that the last dragon is interested in meeting the dragon she did not know existed. Tyrion looked at her for a moment with the expression he wore when she surprised him, which was one of his better expressions. And if Jon Snow is everything Robb Stark says he is? He asked. Then, Daenerys said, we will have a great deal to discuss. She walked back to Drogon and put her hand on his jaw again. And above them the dawn broke fully over the narrow sea, orange and vast and indifferent. And somewhere to the north her nephew was, riding south through a world that didn't yet know his name. Jon rode south through a Westeros that felt like a different country. He had been at the wall long enough that the south had become theoretical, a place of ravens and reports, of names attached to battles he tracked on maps by candlelight, of a war he followed the way a man watches weather through a window, knowing it will eventually come to him, but not yet standing in it. Riding through it was different. Riding through it with Ghost at his horse's flank and Ed Tollett's farewell still in his ears and his brother's letter folded against his chest was different. In a way he had not anticipated, not the strangeness of return, but the strangeness of arrival, as though he were coming to a place for the first time rather than going back to one he had left. The north looked tired. It was not the tiredness of defeat. The villages he passed were not burned. The people he encountered were not broken in the particular way that occupation breaks people. It was the tiredness of sustained effort, of a land that had been feeding armies and absorbing losses for 2 years and was beginning to feel the weight of it in the specific way that weight accumulates in stone walls and clouded eyes, in the particular silence of people who have learned not to ask when it will be over. He stopped at a village outside Moat Cailin and ate with a family who did not know who he was, and listened to them talk about the young wolf with the complicated pride and fear of people whose king had not yet lost, but had not yet won either. And he thought about what Robb was giving up and why, and found the why increasingly legible the further south he rode. He met Robb at the crossroads and south of the Neck. It was deliberate. Robb had ridden north to meet him halfway, which was the kind of gesture that said something without requiring words. Jon saw him from 100 yards and recognized him immediately, not because Robb looked the same as he had at Winterfell, but because he looked the way Winterfell had looked, older and harder, and somehow more itself for the hardness. He had their father's bearing now, the particular straightness that Ned Stark had, carried not as posture, but as a relationship with gravity, as though the weight of responsibility had settled into his spine and he had made peace with it. They embraced in the inn's yard, which was muddy and cold and smelled of horse and cook fire, and neither of them said anything for a moment, because the moment was already full. You look terrible, Robb said. You look like father, Jon said. Robb pulled back and looked at him, and there was something in his face, grief and relief and a complicated love that had always been uncomplicated before. And then he nodded, once, and let it be what it was. They sat inside by the fire, just the two of them, Catelyn and Howland Reed having withdrawn, with the tactful grace of people who understood that certain conversations needed space. Ghost lay by the hearth and gray wind lay beside him, the two dire wolves arranged in the comfortable proximity of creatures who had not seen each other in years and felt no need to make a performance of the reunion. Robb placed their father's letter on the table between them. Jon looked at it. He had his own copy. Robb had sent it with the original Raven, a careful transcription in Robb's hand, but the original was different. The original had the blotted ink and the slanting letters, and the faint dark stain in the upper corner that Jon had not let himself think too hard about. I've read it 40 times, Jon said. I got to about 12 before it stopped being a surprise, Robb said. After that it just started being real. Jon picked it up. He did not read it again. He had no need to read it again, but he held it the way a man holds something that has redefined the context of his entire life, which requires physical contact to fully believe. Tell me about him, Jon said. Tell me what you know about Rhaegar. Robb told him what Jaime had said, and what Hallenreed had said, and what the letter said between the lines. If you read it for the man rather than the information. He told it carefully and fully, without editorializing. In the way their father had always presented difficult truths. Here is the thing, and here are the facts of the thing. And I will not tell you what to feel about it, because that is yours to determine. Jon listened. Ghost's ear twitched once. He's been described to me two ways, Jon said when Robb finished. As the man who dishonored our family by taking our aunt, and as a man who believed he was fulfilling a prophecy. He paused. I don't know which is true. Both might be, Robb said. Yes. Jon set the letter down. Both might be. He looked at the fire. I've been thinking about the succession. So have I. She'll contest it, Jon said. Daenerys. She'll have to. She's built. Everything she's done has been built on being the last Targaryen. On having the only claim. If I'm real then. She's already sent a raven, Robb said. She wants to meet you. Jon looked at him. Tyrion Lannister wrote separately, Robb added. He suggested that her grace is, and I'm quoting, more interested in the man than the complication, which may or may not be reassuring depending on your perspective. Jon almost smiled. Tyrion. He's her hand. He's been, from what I can tell from the ravens, he's been the thing keeping her political instincts from becoming her political actions, which seems like an exhausting job. She has dragons, Jon said. 3. Yes. Jon looked at the fire for a moment. He had been thinking about the dragons since Robb's first letter, thinking about them not as political assets or military weapons, but as creatures, which was perhaps not the standard frame of analysis, but was the one that presented itself most naturally to a man who had grown up with a direwolf. He thought about what it meant that Daenerys had bonded with 3 of them, had hatched them from stone eggs through blood magic and fire and grief, had raised them from creatures small enough to fit in a palm to things that could swallow a horse. He thought about what that kind of bond required of a person and what it revealed. I'm not going to take her throne from her, Jon said. Robb looked at him steadily. It's not her throne. It's not mine either. He met Robb's eyes. I didn't ask for it. I didn't earn it. I've earned my place at the wall and the trust of the men I commanded in. He stopped. And I've earned the ground I've stood on. I haven't earned a throne. No one earns a throne, Robb said. They inherit it, or they take it, or someone gives it to them. The question is what they do with it once they have it. What would you do? Jon asked. If you were me. Robb was quiet for a moment. I'd meet her first, he said. I'd look her in the eye and decide what kind of person she is before I decided anything about claims and succession. Because the political question and the human question are not the same question. And the North will follow me into whatever comes next. But I'd rather they were following something real than something theoretical. Jon nodded slowly. It was, he thought, the most Robb thing Robb had ever said. The instinct to make the personal decision before the political one. The belief that character preceded strategy. It was also, he recognized with a slight internal shift, going to be both their greatest strength and their most exploitable weakness in the months ahead. There's something else, Jon said. The dead, Robb said immediately, because he knew Jon, and he had been waiting for this. The dead, Jon confirmed. Robb, I need you to understand that everything else, the throne, the succession, Daenerys, Tywin Lannister, all of it, is noise compared to what is coming from the north. I have seen the Night King. I have seen what he does. I have seen an army that numbers in the tens of thousands and grows every time it wins. He leaned forward. Dragonglass kills them. Valyrian steel kills them. Fire kills them. Daenerys's dragons are the most significant military asset in the known world against the army of the dead, which means every political decision we make in the next 6 months has to be made with one question underneath it. Does this bring the dragons north, or does this take them south? Robb held his gaze. Then, that's what we tell her when we meet her. She'll want the Iron Throne, Jon said. She's wanted it her whole life. So did every king in this war, Robb said. Most of them are dead. The ones who are left. He paused. The ones who are left are the ones who wanted something bigger than the throne. He picked up his wine and held it for a moment without drinking. Tell her about Hardhome. Tell her what you saw. Tell her about the Night King raising the dead on that beach. Give her something to want that's larger than the Iron Throne. and then see what she chooses. Jon looked at his brother, at this man who had given up a crown freely, who had navigated the Red Wedding without blood on the floor of the twins, who had managed Roose, Bolton and Jaime Lannister and Walder Frey with a political intelligence that their father had possessed in potential, but never quite in practice, and felt something. That was not quite pride because pride implied separation and they were not separate, had never been separate, even across the years and the wall and the distance of different wars. When did you get so wise? Jon said. I've been talking to Tyrion Lannister by Raven for 2 weeks, Robb said. It accelerates the process considerably. They sat by the fire for another hour, talking about smaller things, Winterfell's ruins and the plan to rebuild, Arya's whereabouts which neither of them knew precisely, Sansa in the Vale and the complicated question of Littlefinger's influence there. They talked about the Karstarks, who had fractured as predicted, and about Roose Bolton, who had returned from his Eastern assignment with perfect obedience and perfect opacity, and whom Robb was managing, with the particular care of a man handling something volatile in a room with other volatile things. They talked about their father. They talked about him the way sons talk about dead fathers when there is finally space to do it, not politically, not strategically, just personally, as men who had loved him and lost him and were still finding him in their own decisions and ways. They had not expected. He'd have hated all of this, Jon said eventually. The maneuvering, the ravens, using Jaime Lannister as a political instrument. Yes, Robb agreed. He'd have wanted to walk into Walder Frey's hall and simply tell the truth and trust that truth would be sufficient, and it would have gotten him killed. Again, Robb said, with the particular dry weight of a man who had already grieved this. They were quiet for a moment. He'd have been proud of you, Jon said, for giving it up. Robb shook his head slowly. He'd have been proud of you, he said, for what you're about to take on. Outside the crossroads inn, the wind had picked up, coming from the north with the specific quality that northern wind had in late autumn, not yet the full weight of winter, but its announcement, the advance notice of something enormous and patient that was already in motion and would not be stopped by anything as small as a human war. Ghost raised his head from the hearth and looked at the door, ears forward. Grey Wind looked at Ghost. Then he looked at Robb. Then both direwolves lay back down, side by side, and the fire burned. And the brothers sat in its warmth for a little while longer before the world outside required them again. They met at Dragonstone on a morning that couldn't decide what it was. The sky above the Blackwater Rush was the particular gray of Westerosi. Autumn at its most honest, not stormy, not clear, simply present, in the way of weather that has given up pretending to be anything other than what it is. The tide was low. The island's volcanic rock, black and jagged at the waterline, gleamed with the particular wet darkness of stone that had been shaped by something older and hotter than any current fire. The castle itself rose from the island like something that had grown there, rather than been built. All gargoyles and dragon-carved buttresses, the architecture of a dynasty that had understood from the beginning that power should look like power. Daenerys was on the cliff when their boat made land. Jon saw her from the water, a small figure in dark clothing at the cliff's edge, silver hair catching what light the morning offered, and above her, circling in slow enormous arcs, Drogon. The dragon's shadow passed across the boat twice as they approached, and the oarsmen did not speak during either pass, because there was nothing adequate to say when something that large moved overhead and you were in something that small. Jon watched the dragon and thought, fire kills them. The dead. Fire kills them. He thought it deliberately, as a tool against the other thoughts, the ones about succession and legitimacy, and the 17 years this woman had spent believing herself alone. Robb stood beside him in the boat. Neither of them spoke. The meeting had been arranged with the kind of careful diplomatic scaffolding that Tyrion Lannister excelled at, neutral ground, equal delegations, no throne rooms, no submission postures. They would meet in the chamber of the painted table, which was large enough to hold both parties without crowding and symbolically neutral in the way that a room full of maps was always neutral. It was about the territory, not the people claiming it. These had been Tyrion's conditions, communicated through ravens, accepted on both sides with the speed of people who recognized that the conditions were less important than the meeting. She was already inside when they arrived. Jon had prepared himself for this moment in the specific way that men prepare for things they cannot fully prepare for by deciding in advance what he would look for and what he would not allow to determine his response. He would look at her face. He would listen to how she spoke. He would not be moved by the dragons, or by her history, or by the particular gravity that accrued to people who had survived extraordinary things, because he had survived his own extraordinary things and knew that survival was not the same as wisdom. He was not entirely successful. Daenerys Targaryen was smaller than he had imagined, which was the first surprise, not small, but scaled to human proportions, in a way that seemed inconsistent with the size of everything she had done. She had their family's coloring, the silver gold hair, the particular quality of bone structure that Valyrian bloodlines produced, but her eyes were violet and steady and held the specific attentiveness of someone who had learned, through necessity, to read rooms very quickly and very accurately. She looked at him. He looked at her. The room contained Tyrion, to her left, with the expression of a man watching a chess game he has helped arrange and is now genuinely uncertain about. Robb, to Jon's right, very still. Missandei, behind Daenerys, composed and watchful. Howland Reed, who had come because his presence was itself a testimony. And on the painted table between them, a map of Westeros that showed every castle, every road, every river, every coastline, the whole of what they were here to discuss, rendered in paint on wood. Your Grace, Jon said. He had decided in advance how to address her, and the decision had not been easy. And he had made it anyway because it was accurate. She was a queen. Whatever else she was a queen. And he was a man who had taken vows of service and broken them for reasons he was still working out. And he was not yet a king in any sense that he had accepted. Jon Snow, she said. Her voice was even, not cold, not warm, even in the way of someone maintaining a temperature deliberately. Or should I? She stopped. What do you prefer to be called? It was, he thought, the right first question. Not what are you or what do you want, but what do you prefer? It was a question about him as a person before. It was a question about him as a political complication. And he noticed it and filed it. Jon, he said. For now. She nodded. Sit down, Jon. Both of you. She sat herself, and the room arranged itself into the shape of a conversation. What followed was unlike any council Jon had attended, which had generally been functional and northern, and concerned with specific, immediate problems. How many men? How much food? Where the enemy was moving. This was something else. It moved through layers, the surface layer of formal exchange, where positions were stated carefully and received carefully. A middle layer where Tyrion and Robb did the work of translation, framing things in language that made agreement more possible than disagreement. And underneath both, a current of something more direct, between Jon and Daenerys, that had less to do with the words being spoken than with what each of them was assessing in the other. She asked him about the wall. He told her. He told her about Hard Home with the same directness he had used with Robb. And he watched her face while he spoke. And her face did what faces rarely did during descriptions of catastrophe. It went more attentive rather than less, leaning toward the information rather than away from it. The way a soldier's face goes when battle becomes real rather than theoretical. The Night King raised them, she said. All of them. At once. Every body on the beach, Jon said, without touching them. He raised his arms, and they stood. He paused. There were thousands. She was quiet for a moment. Then, show me. He looked at her. Not here, she said. After. I want to go north. Not today, not before we've finished here. But I want to see the wall. I want to see what you've seen, or as close to it as possible. Her violet eyes held his steadily. I need to understand what I'm being asked to fight before I decide whether to fight it. It's not a negotiation, Jon said. The dead don't negotiate. No, she said. But I do. And before I bring my dragons north, I need to know that the people asking me to bring them north understand what it means to ask that, what it costs. What happens if one of them, she stopped, and something moved across her face that was not political. What happens if the dead take one of my dragons? The room was very quiet. Jon thought about Viserion, about the blue flame and the collapsed wall, about a future that had almost been and might still be if they made wrong choices here. He had carried that knowledge south with him like a stone. The specific weight of a thing that had not happened yet, but could. He had not told Robb everything about what he feared was coming. He told Daenerys now. He told her about the wall's magical wards and what would happen if they failed. He told her about the Night King's intelligence, that he was not simply a force of nature, but a thinking enemy, that he had strategy, that he had demonstrated the ability to identify threats and respond to them. He told her that a dragon taken by the Night King would not simply be lost. It would be turned. Daenerys listened to this with an absolute stillness that was, Jon thought, the most controlled he had seen her in the hours since they had sat down. When he finished, she looked at her hands on the table for a moment. And then she looked at him. "You're telling me this to frighten me away," she said. "I'm telling you this because you need to know it," he said. "You told me you need to understand what you're fighting before you decide to fight it. This is what you're fighting. I won't soften it because I need something from you." Another silence. Tyrion was looking at Jon with an expression that was equal parts professional, assessment, and something more personal. The look of a man who has encountered, unexpectedly, someone arguing against their own interests for no reason, except that it was accurate, which was an experience. Tyrion had enough to recognize and not quite enough of to be comfortable around. It was Daenerys who broke the silence. And she broke it by doing something Jon had not anticipated. She laughed. It was brief and not entirely happy, but it was real. The laugh of a person encountering something that surprised them in a way they found, against their expectations, refreshing. "You are," she said, "absolutely nothing like I expected." "What did you expect?" Jon said. "Someone who wanted something," she said. "Everyone who sits across from me at a table wants something, and spends the meeting trying to hide it while getting it. You've spent an hour telling me things that make it less likely. I'll agree to what you need." She paused. "Your father did the same thing, from everything I've heard. Told truths that killed him." "Yes," Jon said quietly. "I don't intend to die for truth," she said. "I intend to win." "Good," Jon said. "So do I." They looked at each other across the painted table, across the map of everything they were both claiming some version of, and something shifted in the room. Not resolved, not decided, but moved to a different position. The way a door moves when it is neither open nor closed, but no longer fully latched. Robb, who had said very little, for the last hour in, the specific way of a man who has arranged something and is now watching it become something he hadn't fully predicted, leaned forward. "The Karstarks have declared for the Lannisters," he said. "Tywin has moved an army to the King's Road. We have perhaps 3 weeks before the position we're building here becomes a position we have to defend." He looked at Daenerys. "We need to know what you'll commit, and when, and under what conditions." Daenerys looked at Robb. She looked at Jon. She looked at the map. 3 dragons," she said. "The Dothraki, the Unsullied, and my word, which I give once and do not revise." She paused. "In exchange for one thing." "Name it," Robb said. "I want to know," she said, and her eyes moved to Jon. And the steadiness in them was the steadiness of someone asking something that had been costing them since the moment they'd read a letter on a ship deck with the dawn breaking over the narrow sea. "I want to know what Rhaegar was like. As a person, not as a prince, not as a prophecy, as a man." She paused. "I never got to ask anyone who knew him." The room was still. Jon opened his mouth and then closed it because he didn't know. He hadn't known Rhaegar. He had been 3 days old when Rhaegar died at the Trident, and his entire knowledge of his father was assembled from second-hand accounts and the emotional residue of people who had known him and loved him or hated him or both. He looked at Howland Reed, who was standing quietly at the room's edge. Howland Reed stepped forward. "I'll tell you what I know," he said to Daenerys, in the quiet voice of a man for whom telling this story had been a long time coming. "It isn't everything, but it's true." Daenerys Targaryen folded her hands on the painted table and listened, and the maps lay still beneath them. And outside the castle Drogon circled in the gray morning sky, patient as the tide. Tywin Lannister moved, as he always moved, with the patience of a man who understood that speed was for men who had run out of options. He had watched the ravens fly for 3 weeks. He had watched Robb Stark's declaration move through the north and the Riverlands like a slow fire. Not the explosive kind that consumed everything immediately, but the low smoldering kind that was harder to stop precisely because it didn't announce itself with heat. He had watched Walder Frey go quiet in the particular way that men went quiet when they had changed sides and had not yet told anyone. He had watched Roose Bolton's reports grow shorter and more careful, which told him everything about Bolton's assessment of his own position. He had watched the ravens go east across the narrow sea and, 3 days later, watched different ravens come back. He had watched all of this from King's Landing, from the small council chamber where he sat as Hand of the King. And he had said very little, and he had planned comprehensively. Tywin Lannister's plan had 3 components. Because his plans always had 3 components: attack, contingency, and the move that came after the contingency was exhausted. The attack was the Karstark Alliance and the King's Road Army, 8,000 men under Ser Gregor Clegane moving north, with the specific brutality that the mountain brought to every engagement, which was a kind of strategy in itself. The contingency was the Iron Bank, whose patience he had been quietly courting for months, and whose support for whatever king sat the throne was always available to the highest bidder. The third move, the one after, was Joffrey. Joffrey was the problem with all 3 components. He sat the Iron Throne with the particular entitlement of a boy who had been told since birth that entitlement was a form of strength, and he had never learned otherwise because Cersei had loved him too much to teach him, and Robert had been too drunk to try. He was cruel in the specific way of people who had never experienced consequence. Not calculating cruelty, not Tywin's cold, purposeful kind, but the crackling, impulsive cruelty of someone who had discovered that power meant never having to stop. He had executed Ned Stark against every piece of advice Tywin had offered, and he had alienated the Tyrells by humiliating Marjorie in open court, and he had twice countermanded battle orders with instructions of his own that had cost lives and ground for no strategic purpose. He was, in the vocabulary of Westerosi politics, a liability. Tywin had been managing the liability for 2 years. He was growing tired of managing it. But what approach from the north? A unified Stark Targaryen, claim backed by dragons and northern armies and the Tyrells, who had quietly signaled their reconsideration through Olenna's ravens, was the kind of threat that required a managed liability to be managed very well indeed. And Tywin was no longer confident in his ability to manage Joffrey during a military engagement of this complexity. He was thinking about this, specifically, when Tyrion's raven arrived. Tyrion's raven was not addressed to Tywin. It was addressed to Cersei, which was either a political calculation or a familial one. And with Tyrion, it was always both simultaneously. Cersei brought it to him anyway, because Cersei, whatever her considerable faults, understood that her father's intelligence was her most reliable weapon, and she was not stupid enough to withhold information from it. The letter said, in Tyrion's characteristic compressed style, "The alliance is real. 3 dragons and 2 armies in the north behind a man who has his father's face in his mother's fire. Joffrey should abdicate. I mean this sincerely and without irony, which you will note is unusual for me. The alternative is King's Landing burning, and I find I am not as indifferent to that prospect as I once was." Tywin read it twice. Then he put it down on the council table, with the deliberate calm of a man filing a document. "He's right," Tywin said. Cersei stared at him. Father, he's asking Joffrey to. I know what he's asking." Tywin looked at his daughter with the eyes of a man who had made calculations she was not yet finished making. "Sit down, Cersei." She sat. He could see the conflict in her, the maternal ferocity that had always been her most genuine quality, the political intelligence that had always been her second most genuine quality, and the specific horror of a mother being asked to see her son clearly. "The dragons," Tywin said. "That is the variable that ends this conversation before it begins. I can maneuver against armies. I have maneuvered against armies my entire life. I cannot maneuver against 3 dragons in open field engagement. No one can." Aegon the Conqueror demonstrated this comprehensively, and his dragons were larger. He paused. "The Targaryen girl is willing to use them. We have confirmation of this from Harrenhal, from Astapor, from Meereen, from every engagement she has fought. She does not use them as a threat. She uses them." Cersei was quiet for a moment. "There are ways to," Qyburn says. "Qyburn says many things," Tywin said. "Qyburn's scorpion bolt killed One dragon in a future. That has not happened yet and will not happen now that the political configuration has changed. He looked at the map on the council wall, the map of Westeros that he had studied since boyhood, that he could read the way other men read faces. The Tyrells are reconsidering. I have known this for a week. Mace is an idiot, but Olenna is not. And Olenna's ravens have been flying north for 10 days. When the Tyrells withdraw, we lose the Reach's grain supply, which means we lose the ability to feed King's Landing through a siege, which means the city turns against us before any army reaches the walls. He said all of this with the flat precision of a man reporting weather. No emotion, simply assessment. What are you saying? Cersei said, and her voice was very controlled. I am saying that the question is not whether we can win this engagement. Tywin said, the question is what we preserve by choosing the manner of our defeat. He met her eyes. House Lannister does not end because a Targaryen sits the Iron Throne. It has survived Targaryen rule before. Casterly Rock still stands. Our gold still flows. What House Lannister cannot survive is King's Landing burned to ash with Joffrey in it, and Cersei, and every Lannister name that has not already fled the city. Cersei looked at him for a long moment with eyes that were working through something enormous and terrible. He watched her do it. He had watched her do it before, watched her confront the gap between what she wanted and what was possible, and he had always found it the most genuine thing about her. This private wrestling, before the mask came back. Tommen, she said quietly. Yes, Tywin said. Tommen. Tommen was 8 years old and gentle and loved cats, and had his father's coloring, and none of his father's worst qualities, because he had not yet been given the opportunity to develop them. He was, in the vocabulary of what came next, a possibility. The new king will need lords, Tywin said. He will need a realm that functions. He will need Casterly Rock's gold and Lannister administrative expertise and a small council that knows how to govern, because he is a man who has spent his life in war and has no experience of peacetime kingship. He paused. We are that. We can be that. We can be the family that made the transition possible, rather than the family that burned with the city we refused to give up. And Joffrey, Cersei said. Tywin was quiet for a moment. He thought about Joffrey, about the boy who had made every wrong choice, with the confidence of someone who had never experienced a right one, who had taken a kingdom in precarious balance and tipped it toward catastrophe through nothing more than the sustained exercise of his own worst nature. He thought about what a trial would look like, and what a deposition would look like, and what other options existed, and he sorted through them with the efficiency of a man who had made worse calculations. Joffrey will abdicate in favor of Tommen, he said. I will speak to him myself. I will make him understand that this is the choice that allows the Lannister name to survive, and that is the argument that will reach him, because despite everything else, he is a Lannister and he knows what the name means. He paused, and if it does not reach him, he did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. 3 days later, Robb Stark's army crossed the Blackwater Rush. They came in the morning, which was Robb's habit, attack at dawn, when the light was behind you and the city's eyes were still adjusting. They came with the northern armies and the river lords and, above them, 2 of Daenerys's dragons, Regal and Viserion, making slow arcs over the city that needed no further explanation. Drogon remained with Daenerys, 2 miles east, a reserve that every defender on King's Landing's walls could see and think about. Jon rode with Robb at the army's head. He had thought about this, about the image of it, the thing it said. A man riding under his own name for the first time, toward a city that had killed his father, beside a brother who had given up a crown to give him one. He had thought about whether it felt like what it was supposed to feel like, and had determined that it felt instead like responsibility, enormous and specific and not glorious in any way that the songs would later capture, because the songs always stripped the weight out and kept only the shape. Grey Wind ran at Robb's left. Ghost ran at Jon's right. The gates of King's Landing opened before they reached them. It was not a surrender in the conventional sense. There was no white flag, no formal delegation, no ritual of submission performed on the steps of the Red Keep. What emerged from the gates was a single figure on a horse, wearing the colors of House Lannister, riding toward them with the bearing of a man who had decided that the manner of his Arrival defined the terms of what came next. Tyrion Lannister pulled up 10 yards in front of them and looked at Jon Snow with the expression of a man meeting someone he has been thinking about for several weeks and finding the reality both consistent with and more complicated than the expectation. "Your Grace," he said. And there it was, the title, used by a Lannister, outside the gates of King's Landing, in front of an army. The political fact of it, stated plainly in the morning air. Jon looked at him. He thought about what Robb had said at the crossroads. Give her something to want. That's larger than the Iron Throne, and thought about how the same principle applied here, to this city, to this moment, to the man in front of him who was offering the transition. Because he had calculated that it was the only thing that saved what he actually cared about. "Lord Tyrion," Jon said, "is the city intact?" "The city is intact," Tyrion said. "Joffrey has abdicated. Tommen is 8 years old and will require a regent." A pause. "I've taken the liberty of suggesting to your," he glanced at Robb, "to the former king in the north that Lady Sansa Stark might be appropriate for certain advisory roles, given her extended residence in King's Landing and her detailed knowledge of its functioning." He looked back at Jon. "I mention this because it seemed like the kind of suggestion that should come from a friend rather than a political document." Robb looked at Jon. Jon looked at the city, at the walls of it, at the towers and the harbor and the smoke from 1,000 morning cook fires rising into the gray sky, at the red keep on its hill with the Iron Throne somewhere inside it, that seat of swords that every king for 3 centuries had wanted and that several of them had died reaching for. He did not feel what he had expected to feel, standing here. He felt the weight of the north behind him. He felt Robb at his right. He felt Ghost at his left, white and still. He felt his father's letter, still folded against his chest after all the weeks of writing. The paper soft now at the creases, the ink held in careful against his heartbeat. He thought. He kept the promise. He kept it all the way to the block. He thought, "Don't waste it. Ride with us, Lord Tyrion," Jon said. "There's work to do." Tyrion looked at him for a moment, with the expression he wore when something surprised him in a direction he found tolerable, which was one of his better expressions and apparently not one he got to wear as often as he deserved. "There always is," Tyrion said, and turned his horse and rode back toward the city he had spent his life loving and being failed by, now carrying something different, not hope exactly, which Tyrion distrusted on principle, but its functional equivalent, the reasonable expectation that the next catastrophe would be a new one rather than the same one repeated. Jon Stark, Jon Targaryen, Jon Snow, rode through the gates of King's Landing on a gray autumn morning, between his brother and his hand, under the slow circling shadows of dragons, toward a throne he had not asked for and intended to deserve. The city watched from its windows, and its alleys and its docks, and its steps and its market stalls, and the city had seen kings come before and knew what kings cost, and was not yet certain what this one would cost, and was going to find out. Above the red keep, a dragon called, high and carrying the sound of something ancient, announcing itself to a world that had forgotten what it meant to hear that sound and feel something other than fear. Below it, 2 direwolves moved through the gates and did not look back. In the weeks that followed, Westeros did what it always did after a great upheaval. It adjusted. Not graciously, not uniformly, not without cost, but with the grinding pragmatic resilience of a continent that had survived Aegon's conquest and the Dance of Dragons and the Long Nights. Last approach in 3 centuries of Targaryen rule and Robert's rebellion, and had emerged from all of it still standing, still arguing, still planting crops in autumn against the coming of winter. Jon Snow sat the Iron Throne and found it precisely as uncomfortable as advertised. He sat it anyway. He sat it with Robb at his right hand and Tyrion as his hand and Daenerys as his ally. His aunt, his equal, the woman who had brought her dragons west and looked at the wall and believed him about the dead in a way that no southern lord had managed, and who had returned to Essos to settle what remained of her governance, there with the specific intention of coming back north when the long night finally announced itself. It announced itself 6 months later. But that is another story. What the Maesters recorded in the cautious language of men who preferred not to commit to certainty until certainty was unavoidable, was that the transition had been achieved without the burning of King's Landing, without the Red Wedding, without the deaths that other versions of this war had required. What the small folk recorded, in the songs that began appearing in taverns within a fortnight, was simpler. The wolf gave up the crown. The dragon came home. The dead still came, but the fire was ready. Robb Stark returned to the north and began rebuilding Winterfell, stone by stone, in the way that Starks had always rebuilt things, without ceremony, with patience, with the specific northern understanding that what endured was not the dramatic gesture but the persistent one. He kept his father's letter. All men must die, but legends endure. More stories await.